Great. Okay. Thank you, Simon and Jonathan, for coming today. Just to say a little bit about the Commission. Bright Blue is doing a project at the moment trying to carve out a balanced, positive, centre-right agenda on immigration. There are various different elements to this project, but one of them is this Commission. We've already invited academics and organisations to submit written evidence, which we received in August, and today is an oral evidence session with various different experts across different policy areas on immigration. The aim is, like a House of Commons Select Committee, that we will publish both the verbal and the oral evidence in a report at the end of the year, with at the front some policy recommendations from Bright Blue. The commissioners here are a range of commissioners from different backgrounds with different perspectives. Though they won't necessarily endorse everything that Bright Blue says in the final report, they'll be very critical here today in asking you very searching questions. So this particular session, which will run for about 45 minutes, is on business and growth. What I'll do is I will ask you both to introduce yourselves and then just say a couple of minutes introductory remarks on where you think the government is going right and where you think it's going wrong on the business and growth agenda. And then after that, commissioners will dive in with their questions. So we'll start with Jonathan Portes.
Okay, I'm Jonathan Portes. I'm the director of the National Institute of Economic and Social Research. I've been doing that for 3 years. Before that, I was chief economist of the Cabinet Office, and before that, chief economist of the Department for Work and Pensions. And I've been involved in the immigration debate, especially in terms of the economic and labour market impacts of immigration for the last 15 years or so. Briefly, where are we now? Well, I mean, you have a lot of this in the written evidence, so I won't say very much except a couple of points. The contradiction between talking about the UK being open for business and imposing a progressively more restrictive policy on immigration has been much remarked, not by me, but by many others, and it's pretty obvious. That's at a rhetorical level. Let me try and say a little bit more about the economics. I think the key thing for me here is the analogy, both in economic and political economy terms, between immigration and trade openness. The economics of both are quite similar. If you write down the models, they're formally virtually identical. So it's not just there's a philosophical point, but there's also an economic point. And that matters quite a lot when it comes to the impact of immigration on growth. Because in both cases, static models, quantifiable static models, will tell you that the impact of immigration or trade on both growth in a per capita GDP sense, both growth, welfare, prosperity, is positive but small. That's what the static models tell you. There are very few economists who believe that. Almost all economists believe that both for trade and immigration, the impacts are are considerably larger than the static models tell you, and that while it's quite complicated, they're likely to be positive. The positive impacts are likely to be much larger over the medium to long term. That's because of impacts that you don't get in the very simple static models where you've got lines crossing. It's because of dynamic impacts on productivity, competition, various externalities which can be positive or negative that come from transfer of skills and so on. So I won't say more about that, but I think that's a very important point when people talk about that really quite dreadful and economically not very good House of Lords report in 2008 saying that the impact on per capita GDP growth was small. They simply missed that point. But it's one that most economists will tell you. And I would emphasize that the economic consensus on this is pretty strong. I would refer you, this is a point I think is important actually, refer you to, so you know, there's not one of the things where there are economists on both sides of the argument. There are, but there's a pretty clear consensus. I would refer you to the survey done by the Centre for Macroeconomics, which is the LSE, UCL, Cambridge, Bank of England Centre, which polls every month about 50 leading economists on various issues, ranging from fiscal policies of Scotland, whatever. They did one on immigration a couple of months ago, and there is an economic consensus on this issue. The second thing I think is worth mentioning is, and this is a criticism that I would apply to all parties and a number of people who think about this on this issue, but it particularly applies to the people on the centre right, because they ought to know better than this, which is the myth of central planning in immigration. This idea that you can pick the right people with the right skills, that we might need, this type of nuclear engineer, but not this type of heart surgeon this year, but it might be the other way next year. We need an immigration system which does that. We can't centrally plan the labour market, and we shouldn't try. An immigration system that works, regardless of what you think about the overall numbers, an immigration system that works well should try and be flexible, responsive to the market, not have bureaucrats in the Home Office trying to decide who might make a contribution and who wouldn't. I'll stop there.
Okay, Jonathan, just to summarise your position, so the academic evidence is, although it's limited from this kind of static modelling, is that there's small but positive growth, but most economists believe, because of further dynamic effects, that it's probably much bigger. But there isn't the evidence to suggest.
Well, there's some evidence.
Right.
There is some evidence, but it's not nearly as strong as the short-term, much more easily quantifiable evidence. There is a review, which I can send to you, by my colleague Max Nathan, of the impact, the wider impacts. So there is some evidence, but it's much more piecemeal.
Okay, yeah, it would be helpful if you could send that through. Thank you. Simon.
Right, I'm Simon Walker, Director General of the Institute of Directors. I'd disclaim any suggestion that I was an expert, I should say, on this topic, but I cannot reflect our members' views. We have 38,000 members around the country, and we poll them on a number of questions, and immigration is one of them. But also, I'd say it crops up anecdotally an awful lot as I'm speaking to businesses, medium, small, and some large businesses, about the issues that they face. And broadly, our members are very positive about the overall effects of immigration and of immigrants. They employ a lot of immigrants. A reason for that is certainly skills in many cases, but it's also bluntly motivation. They find, one of them said to me, travelling across Europe to look for a job is worth an interview in itself. They feel that the sort of people who come and work here are highly motivated and will be hard workers. Quite often, a sort of nucleus of individuals from other countries come over, and that expands and brings in lots of reliable workers who know each other. So they're positive about migration and migrants overall. I think we also feel that an awful lot of businesses are started up by entrepreneurs who've come to Britain, because Britain and London in particular are magnets for ambitious people internationally. And I think there's data that says 1 in 7 companies that started up has been started by someone who's immigrated to this country. Correspondingly, we're concerned about the degree of hysteria that there is about immigration, and we think politicians have stirred that up and have provoked it a lot of the time. I think there was a populist poll a couple of months ago that showed immigration as the top issue of concern to voters, which I don't doubt, 56%, running well ahead of the economy, health, welfare. Although only 19%, when they were actually asked what were the issues that affected them and their family, said that. So there is an hysteria about immigrants that we think ought to be quelled by politicians. I mean, I'm actually really pleased to see that Yvette Cooper has committed the Labour Party to scrapping the immigration cap. And one of the particular flows through that I'd like to mention on that our members are concerned about is students. The number of foreign students studying at universities here fell for the first time in 30 years to this April. We're particularly concerned about the way that students are classified with ordinary migrants in a political dogfight. And we'd suggest that even people who feel that immigration should be tightened up might be able to agree with us on better definitions in that regard, and of a shift classification of people who are here to study. The final point I'd make is that we're not just talking about immigrants from Europe. A lot of our member companies refer to immigrants from other countries as well, particularly those that have had a tradition of sending people here who work here. And in that context, I'm originally South African myself, and the number of work visas to South Africans has gone from 27,000 to 2,200 over the past 10 years, to New Zealanders from 9,000 to 5,000, and from Australians from 30,000 to 15,000. We think that kind of tightening up, which we suspect is politically driven because of acute sensitivity, particularly in the Home Office, which is the one department that we think just doesn't get immigration as a business issue and sees this as a totem. We think that's damaging for the economy as a whole, and we see companies that don't feel able to or don't feel inclined to employ that jolly good person from outside the EU who'd bring in some fresh ideas. We've done it ourselves at the IOD, because it's that much more expensive and that much less likely that an application to bring them in will succeed. And we think that damages this country's status as a kind of intellectual capital of the world. And I'd say that in broad terms. We accept there are issues around immigration that are difficult for some of the people who feel that services are limited to them, but we feel that the net benefit is substantial, and we wish politicians would say so.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Just a quick question is, you say broadly business is positive about the effects of immigration. Are there particular sectors that are more positive about immigration and particular sectors which are less positive about immigration or less concerned about it? It's less of a need to rely on immigrant labour?
I very rarely encounter anyone within the IOD membership who is negative, any business that is negative about immigration. I can hardly think of any cases other than sort of theoretical ones where people have said, well, we know with the housing shortage, we know the pressure on social services that people must feel. It's that kind of generalised feeling rather than around individuals who work for those businesses. In that sense, it's enormously positive. But bluntly, there's a lot of emphasis around London and the South East particularly, around people in service jobs who just appear to be a lot more motivated and a lot more enthusiastic than their British counterparts. And we know of no member who'd prefer to employ foreigners as a positive measure, but that's the way applications tend to flow.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Sunder, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, a sort of informational point to start with. Efforts to reduce the numbers haven't been enormously successful in headline terms, partly because of EU free movement. Clearly, they have managed to reduce numbers from outside the EU a bit more. But given that the numbers have actually stayed quite high, how hard is the evidence that the current curbs so far have already hit the economy or growth, and what sort of form does that evidence take? And a sort of follow-up one more, perhaps for Jonathan, is how far is it, would you accept the case either that there are winners and losers from this distribution leap, or is it more that the gains are not evenly spread? Where would you put yourself on that kind of spectrum?
The answer to the first question is that there isn't a lot of hard evidence yet. We simply haven't got enough decent disaggregated time series data to really focus on that. I mean, you can say, obviously, that, say, English language schools obviously have suffered, and some bits of the FE sector have suffered very seriously. Now, some of those were fraudulent institutions. Some of them were perfectly good small businesses earning, contributing to UK exports, who've also been shut down as a consequence. But that's a sectoral impact. Have there been impacts in specific industries and sectors from the curbs on skilled immigration? It is, as I say, we do not have sufficient disaggregated data. There's some anecdotal evidence. We all know anecdotes. I can certainly, we certainly know in the university sector, not as though there have been impact on students, but you can point to particular examples where some of our more internationally competitive universities have been precluded from hiring people. But there isn't a lot of quantitative evidence yet. On the distributional impacts, I think there clearly are losers, but it's quite difficult to come up with big aggregate groups that look like losers. I mean, I think, if you try and say, well, young unemployed people have been the losers, that doesn't really seem to show up in the data. There's no evidence for it. If you try and say that the North has been a loser or whatever, but clearly there must be, at some disaggregated level, people who've been competed out of jobs by immigrants. Now, the result is, as we know, there's no lump of labour policy fallacy. It doesn't reduce the number of jobs in the economy, so somebody else gets a job. But there must be some distributional effects within groups. We find that quite hard to pick up at any level of aggregation we look at. You probably saw the thing that I wrote about after I was interviewed by Nick Robinson for that documentary. Coming back to the trade analogy, in contrast to when we closed down the coal mines, which, from an economic point of view, was the right thing for the country. It was very easy, specifically, to enter trade. This community lost, this group of people lost, and the economy as a whole benefited. It's much harder to point at a group here and say, well, school leavers in Hull have lost. Well, not really.
Okay, Simon, did you want to?
I don't really have any data to offer. That's the only thing I'd say. But many anecdotes about a business in the Midlands that's still dealing with someone in Colombia whom they had to send away. Another one that's dealing with people over the internet in Japan because they couldn't. They'd much rather have them here. And I accept, as Jonathan says, that there must be some losers. But if you look at the fact that the UK Fruit Growers Association is sort of pleading with the government to be more lenient in allowing non-Europeans outside the EU to come over here to pick fruit, it does seem to me that the problem is a lot of people in Britain who could take up those opportunities choose not to. And that's a choice that is available to them. But it is a choice. And if people choose to make that choice, I don't think they can expect farmers and fruit distributors to have their businesses incapacitated by a lack of willingness to work, because there are social welfare systems here that provide them with an alternative.
Okay, David, you want to?
Well, just on that point, I mean, is it possible that there might be certain jobs in the UK that we simply can't sustain here profitably on wages that are decent enough in our kind of society? Fruit picking seems to be one of them. I mean, why do we grow strawberries here? Why don't we just import them?
It's conceivable, and I can't argue with that. But I suspect there'll always be a desire to. There are always going to be people growing strawberries and people growing apples, and if they can't find willing workers at whatever the minimum wage is, then if other people want to come in and do that for a period, that seems to be entirely healthy in every social sense.
Okay. Let me. I mean, that was just picking up on that last point. Let me ask you 2 or 3 very quick questions. The out of EU quota, whatever it is, 21,000 a year, has only been half filled, I think, for the last 2 or 3 years. How do you explain that? Is it because the bureaucracy is so great that it's put people off trying to bring people in through that route? I mean, on the face of it, it seems that the restrictions, the out of EU restrictions on skilled workers, has worked pretty well. Some of the complaints that we heard from your organisation and others have not been vindicated. You mentioned earlier that employers like people from abroad because they're already trained. Do you not think that the very relatively high inflows we've had in recent years has depressed spending on training? Final point, do you think British employers do have any kind of special obligation to British citizens? Are there such things as national social contracts that employers should feel part of? If not British jobs for British workers, then British jobs for British workers wherever reasonably possible.
Sorry, David, what was the first point again?
The quota.
The quota.
Just been half filled.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that it can be very expensive and very time-consuming and very bureaucratic to get a permit to come to this country. And I know that because as an Australian we would like to have got in here, but the estimate was that it would be around £10,000 in legal fees, and it would take a long time and be pretty uncertain. And if you're in a situation where you're looking at someone who has no automatic right to work in this country, but I think in that case would have brought cross-fertilised intellectually some rather interesting ideas, I backed off even thinking of it because the hassle of that, while there are quite a lot of bright, young, able people with many of the same skills in this country, it just means it's an awful lot easier. So I think that happens a lot. But I think it's unfortunate for the UK. I mean, the chairman of the National Health Service is a New Zealander who came here as a student 40 years ago and stayed. Half the High Court is, there are many senior judges in this country who have come from abroad in exactly the same situation. This country benefits from being a global hub for all intellectual and professional activity, and I think that's one of the most fantastic characteristics of Britain in general and London in particular. I think training is important, but actually with our members it's motivation that is number one on the points that they differentiate people who come from abroad, particularly from EU countries, rather than training. They do feel there are training deficiencies amongst many of the candidates here, and I know the London Chamber of Commerce says that there's a 60% shortage of domestic candidates with the right skills. But I think I would put motivation ahead of that in terms of our membership. Do I think there's some sort of a national social contract? No, I don't really. I believe good businesses have a sense of the communities that they are part of, and they will always do better in business terms if they play a full part in their community. I think that's a general truism, which I believe absolutely. But I think any kind of British jobs for British workers approach would be very damaging to this country. I think it already does damage perceptions of this country. I mean, this is no longer seen as being as welcoming as it once was, and I think our image...
But you're not worried that your members are hugely on the wrong side of public opinion on this issue there, and their opinions differ hugely from their customers and probably their employees as well?
I think public opinion is whipped up into a froth by politicians from all parties, incidentally, who are being pretty irresponsible on this issue. I think there's an excellent article you'll probably have seen by Gus O'Donnell in the Times last year, that said how in 1978 there was the same high level of concern about immigration at a time when net immigration was actually negative. It's a very easy topic to work the public up into emotionally.
I don't think Gus is a neutral figure in this debate.
I'd give real weight to what he said in that piece, which I thought was sober and sensible. What I would be interested in seeing if one could explore is diffusing the migrant base more around the country, because I do suspect that the magnet of London and the southeast is particularly attractive, and there's 100 reasons why it is. I mean, it's a much nicer, more interesting place to live in terms of exposure to culture and so on, and the experience of being in Britain. And if there were ways of evening that out, I think that would be a good thing.
Have you thought about how we might send more people to Scotland that apparently wants more immigration? I mean, how might we do that?
I don't know how, but I certainly think it's worth exploring.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Carlos, you can just come in.
Yeah, I have two questions. Simon, one thing is these restrictions have been on non-EU migration. And I guess if you're a business and you cannot recruit from South Africa or New Zealand, probably one of the first things that come to your mind is to recruit from the EU. So have you seen any, I know you don't have hard numbers, have you seen any evidence that these people are just recruiting more from the EU, from these 500 million people there, in response to the restrictions from the government? And for Jonathan, of course there's also a distinction between high skill and low skill migration. Can you talk about low skill migration from the EU? Is low skill migration from the EU good for the economy? And if low skill migration is good, should we just open low skill migration from non-EU countries to the UK? If it is a good thing or if it is not a good thing.
Right. I believe there is statistical evidence, it's not ours, but to say that the fall-off in skilled or relatively skilled migrants from outside the EU has led to an increase in EU people with those similar skills coming into the UK. So, in fact, I don't think there is a net benefit from the perspective of potential UK candidates for those jobs. But what it does mean is, from a business perspective, the pool you can draw from is that much smaller, and that has to be disadvantageous. Should we just let everyone in? Well, in an ideal world, perhaps, but I mean, taking David's point, I recognise that public opinion probably just wouldn't end up accepting that. And I think there are perception problems, which I get, about so-called welfare tourism, and any cracking down on that any political party wished to take is something that I think IOD members would probably be perfectly happy about, and I know other EU member states are quite positive about that too. I think the contributory principle is a good one, and I'm rather sorry it's not rather more sensibly applied in this country as it is in places like France. Look, yes, I accept you can't, at a time that you're offering welfare largesse effectively in the way that many poor potential migrants from outside the EU would see it, I accept you can't just let the floodgates open. But one day I'd like to see global exchange of talent on a really open scale.
Okay, a few points. First of all, David's point about training. To the extent that there is any data, it suggests that there's probably a positive correlation between companies which hire migrants and companies which do more training. We found that in some research we did. That wasn't quantitative, it was qualitative. But I suspect that if you looked at the aggregate quantitative data, you get the same result. Now that might more likely be an association rather than causation. But there's certainly no evidence that I know of that suggests that companies train less because they have access to immigration. Certainly not the medium and high skill levels. The low skilled labour market is, as Simon said, I think I don't entirely agree with everything Simon said about the motivation issue, but I think it is about there are issues there around motivation, attitudes rather than skills. But in terms of actual formal training for qualifications and skills, the evidence to suggest that there's some sort of displacement really doesn't appear to be there.
And you don't think it affects the productivity issue? I mean, the fact that, you know, whatever it is, sort of 3 or 4 million people come in over a period of 10 years or so, probably half of them, if not more, into low-skilled jobs. That sustains lots of low-skill, low-paid employment, but surely has an effect on national productivity. I'm very surprised it's not mentioned more in the debate about why our productivity has been so low.
Well, it's probably not mentioned because productivity was doing absolutely fine until in fact, the UK's productivity performance during the high migration period, 97 to 2008, was historically and internationally rather good. People talked about why the UK was doing well in productivity terms.
Well, as you know, there are lag effects in economies, and this could be one of them.
Well, it could be, but there's certainly not a lot of evidence to sustain it. If you look again at productivity across regions or sectors, you don't really see that evidence. What we have seen, of course, is the stuff that we did looking at immigration and immigrants and productivity is showing again a positive correlation, and we don't know what the causation is. Positive correlation between immigrant shares in sector regions and productivity growth. Not just from the immigrants being more highly skilled than the natives, which they still are on average, remember, David, but also through, quote, spillover effects onto the rest of the company, the sort of thing Simon was talking about the exchange of ideas, meaning the British workers were more productive as a result of coming into contact with the immigrants. Again, we do not know. This is very early stuff. We do not know whether this is association or causation, or if so, which way the causation goes. But the evidence there is fairly positive. Why haven't the skilled workers the only cap that there actually is on tier 2 skilled workers? Why hasn't that actually bitten? Well, Carlos asked the question: is there any data about displacement? Well, you know perfectly well, Carlos. You've done the only, with my colleagues Cinzia, you've done the only quantitative analysis of this. So that's what's been done, and it again, there's no causation there, but there's some evidence. There's some suggestion of shifting, which is what you would expect. I think why has the cap not bitten? Well, at least at first it was because the economy was relatively slow. I think it does have to do with the sort of thing Simon was talking about, which is about bureaucracy, particularly for smaller firms. And we've had the same experience. That is to say, the last bunch of applications we got, we had 3 shortlisted candidates, and my before the final interviews, my finance director, chief operating officer, came to me and said, I really much rather you didn't pick this one because we'd have to go through the immigration bureaucracy. Now, of course, the other 2 weren't British either. They were well. One was EU, one was non-EU, but already had residence rights. So we wouldn't have created an extra job for a British worker. But had we, I've forgotten what actually happened, had we chosen the non-EU one because he or she was the best candidate, we would then have been in a dilemma, and I'm sure that applies to lots of small businesses. And I do think it's important that when you're talking about medium to high skill, remember that this is not taking. Even if we had employed a British worker, I do not think that is would have been good for British workers in the economics research industry over the long run. The lump of labour fallacy does not hold. The reason we have such a thriving economics research community in London, including in the export sector, like us, we sell to the rest of the world, is because people want to come here. People want to come and work here. I frequently get this on Twitter from people saying, well, you don't have to deal with consequences of immigration. You probably live out in Surrey, where there aren't any immigrants, and of course you don't have to worry about an immigrant taking your job. Of course I have to worry about an immigrant taking my job. There's no job, senior economics job in the UK for which there would not be good EU and non-EU applicants.
Yeah, as a result, there's hardly any British economists left.
There are plenty of British economists. But Carlos's point about, I mean, this is a very interesting one, and I think, you know,
I'll make this quick, actually.
yeah,
John,
I've said this to you know, to my UKIP friends, my many UKIP friends, but you know, if we were outside of the EU, would we design an immigration policy where we had free movement with Bulgaria and Romania and very restrictive policies towards India and Australia? Of course we wouldn't. We would have to come up with a different system. I do not believe it would involve full openness to low-skilled workers. It would involve some managed low-skilled migration and a level playing for high-skilled migration.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Final question from Matthew.
That plays directly into my question that if you ask voters their views on migration, they often are quite open to high-skilled migration. You know, they're not massively enthusiastic, but they will accept that more than low-skilled. But then at the same time, Jonathan, you mentioned this idea of the myth of central planning, that, you know, governments, politicians are going to find it very difficult to pick the right kinds of people at the right level. So how, in your view, can that tension be resolved, given that parties and politicians by their nature are going to want to stress a point-based approach, are going to want to be able to cherry-pick who comes in and who doesn't? So what's the way forward on that?
I would say the obvious answer is the post-study work route. We ditched the post-study work where, you know, we never had a proper evaluation, but it was fairly clear from the data that from the post-study work route, a bunch of people were going to highly skilled jobs, and some were messing around, doing nothing very much. Some became taxi drivers or worked in restaurants. That's how good immigration works. You take a bunch of people, not because they're, you know, obviously you want to take nuclear engineers if there are jobs, but to a significant extent, we should take people like people who came to the post-study work group, people who've come here, got an education, they can speak English, they like the country or they wouldn't want to stay here. Some of them will fail, and that's what I mean by letting the market work. Some of them will end up as taxi drivers or unemployed. And instead of seeing that as a failure, we should see that as how the market works. As long as enough of them succeed, and enough of them will, that's how you get a relatively... So my first policy priority would be reopening some version of the post-study work group properly.
Simon, did you want to come in?
Yeah, I'd simply like politicians to, from all parties, to start telling the truth about immigration, because I just don't think the public have been told, and I think they've been whipped up through myths for a considerable period now, which is that the object of their real concerns, and there are real concerns out there. I don't want to see people who are convicted of murder being freely admitted to this country anyway, but actually that's a fault of the government and its systems, its management. The proportion of migrants to this country who fall in the area of legitimate public concern is actually very small, and in particular it does not include the student community, and it is doing extraordinary damage to the British university sector, which is a critical part of the UK economy and one of the few things that this country still leads the world.
Simon, just one final quick question from me before we end the session, which is, there is a criticism of those people who are more favourable towards immigration, that sometimes the argument it's very corporatist, and it's large businesses, the business community who are coming behind it. Is there any other actors or arguments that could be employed to have a more kind of favourable approach to immigration?
Well, what I've been struck by in our membership is that it's very often small businesses, quite often the smallest and the most medium-sized, that are the most vociferous, because they become the most dependent on people who've come here from abroad and who become a critical part of their business. In my experience, it's actually the big companies who, yes, occasionally a Rolls-Royce or a BAE Systems will have trouble getting in a particular skilled person, but actually they can cope with that in the end anyway. The costs aren't huge. It's a design studio in the West Midlands that actually that Colombian became quite an important part of, and now they're still having to fax over designs to him to do work from Colombia because they can't fill the gap. I don't know how many people are in that business, but not that many. I know a computer company, half of whose staff are in Slovenia. I mean, that operates between Slovenia and the UK. That's because there happen to be personal links there and an ability to do it through an EU system. These chances have played enormously in the benefit of this country for centuries, actually, and try to close them down now seems to me a terrible mistake.
Okay, thank you, Simon. Thank you, Simon. Thank you, Jonathan, for coming today. Very grateful for your time. Like I say, there will be a film of this published in the next few weeks, and the transcripts from this oral evidence session will be published in the final report coming out towards the end of this year. So thank you very much for your time.